Good morning, folks. We're letting people come into the room and we'll start in just a minute. Good morning again to those just joining. We're waiting about 30 more seconds for people to trickle in. All right, well, why don't we get started? The flow seems to have slowed a bit. Good morning again, everyone. Thank you for coming. Welcome to our webinar on climate risk for cultural institutions, sponsored by the Cultural Institutions Working Group of the Boston Green Ribbon Commission. And just to note, we are recording this session. My name is Amy Longsworth. I'm the Executive Director of the Boston Green Ribbon Commission, which you will also hear referred to today as the GRC. And almost everyone on this call in the audience is a volunteer leader at a cultural institution, and thus in a position to influence the viability of the cultural sector in Boston for decades to come. Your role is so important that we have designed this webinar specifically to explore board management of climate risk, particularly the aspect of fiduciary responsibility. Plainly stated, climate risk is expensive and it must be understood and managed. We have two people to thank in particular today for having the insight that a program like this would be useful. Gwyl York, President of the Board of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, and you'll note I have honored the Gardner Museum's beautiful courtyard in this photograph, and Sharon Malt, President of the Board of the Huntington Theater Company. These two also serve as two of the co-chairs of our cultural working group. I have no doubt that many of you heard from Gwyl and or Sharon over the summer, and the strong attendance here today is indicative of their powers of persuasion. Next slide, please. The Green Ribbon Commission's role is to accelerate implementation of Boston's climate action plan. It's going to be hard for Boston to meet its goals, for the city and the city government to meet its goals, unless every private organization in the city, whatever its size, also has an aligned plan. I want to commend the dozen or so cultural institutions that have participated in our climate action planning program. And I also want to thank the generous cultural trustees whose contributions have enabled us to offer this high quality programming at no cost to the institutions. Next slide, please. Today we'll hear from three speakers. First, Dr. Allison Brizius, Commissioner of the Environment for the City of Boston, will provide about a 15-minute overview of local climate impacts and policies. Then we'll spend 40 minutes hearing from corporate climate and government experts, Stephen Rothstein from Ceres and Deanne Hurd from Plan C Advisors. Stephen and Deanne are going to introduce themselves, so I will simply say that you are going to hear from global experts today. For the final 30 minutes, we'll have a Q&A with all three of our speakers. So please, as we go along, type your questions into the chat. Azanta and I are collecting them, and I will relay them. Sorry, we can't unmute people. We just have too big an audience. Final slide. Again, your leadership is so important as the guardians of our beloved cultural sector. With Mayor Wu focused on implementing a Green New Deal, now is really, truly a moment in time. And I encourage you to engage with the GRC and the city, join our climate action planning cohort, actively seek to present climate-related cultural content at your institutions, and please pay attention to what is going on the climate front in Boston, because things are moving very rapidly. So now let's begin our program, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Allison Brizius.
Thank you, Amy, and good morning, everybody. I'm really excited to be with you here today. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the climate risks in Boston as we understand them, and then highlight a few of the key actions that the city is taking to address these actions. Next slide. So in 2016, 2015 culminating in 2016 is really the time when we started to look in depth at our climate risks in Boston. We undertook a comprehensive citywide vulnerability assessment, and we identified that while there are many other risks, our primary risks under climate change are heat, stormwater flooding, and riverine flooding. Next slide. Coastal and riverine flooding. So I want to show you a series of maps to give you a sense of the scale of this issue. These are all available online. We'll share them out afterwards so that you can look at them in more depth at your leisure. So in Boston, we're going to be experiencing, and we are experiencing, increased heat. We're not just going to be seeing more days of that are hot, but we're going to see more intense and more frequent heat waves. So our daytime air temperature, our nighttime air temperature, so we're not going to have that opportunity to cool down, and our event duration are going to increase. While right now we see about 11 days in a given summer over 90 degrees, over the next 50 years, that could increase to be more than a month over 90 degrees with much longer periods of heat wave in there. So our climate is going to move to be more like the climate of Washington, D.C., and then eventually more like the climate of Birmingham, Alabama, but up here in Boston. Next slide. We're also going to be seeing more frequent and more intense precipitation, stormwater flooding events. Stormwater flooding is already an issue in some areas of the city. And here you're seeing the colors are sort of the depth of the potential stormwater flooding in our neighborhoods over time. Whereas right now, over a 24-hour period, we might see storms in the maybe 4 to 5 inches. We're going to be seeing storms that would drop over 6 inches and increasing into our systems in a compressed period of time. And just to give you a sense, our average curb height in Boston is about 6 inches. So we're talking about storms that over a short period of time are higher than that. Next slide. And really, as a low-lying coastal city, one of our most pressing vulnerabilities is to that of sea level rise with those increasing coastal storms. So I'm going to go through a series of slides here to see the level and extent of flooding we expect to see throughout the city in a 1% annual chance flood with different levels of sea level rise. So to give you a sense, the winter storm Grayson in 2018 was about that 1% annual chance storm, or what we commonly refer to as a 100-year storm. So here's an expectation with about 9 inches of sea level rise that right now we expect in around the 2030s. You can see some areas of the North End and downtown, larger areas of the Seaport and East Boston would be inundated in that scenario. Next slide. Moving out towards around the 2050s with 21 inches of sea level rise, you see this increasing in the extent of flooding impacts. And next slide, as you move out towards 2070s, roughly about 50-year planning horizon, which is common to many buildings. With 36 inches of sea level rise and those coastal floods, you can see large portions of the city would be inundated. In fact, with these storms, we would expect to see by around the 2030s, with 9 inches of sea level rise, up to 18,000 residents and about $20 billion of structural assets at risk. Moving out towards the 2070s with 36 inches of sea level rise, those numbers rise to over 85,000 residents and more than $80 billion of assets at risk in a single storm event. And when you look at annualized losses, you're looking out over the next 50 years at around $1.4 billion in annualized losses across the city. And that's just the structural assets that are easy to quantify. That doesn't begin to cover the potential risks to health or job loss or other things. So there's real risk in the city of Boston, but that is, and we've understood that, and that is why we're taking action to address these risks. We've been, next slide. So we developed a plan. So we weren't just understanding the risk, but we're acting to address it about many layers across our built environment and our social infrastructure to address new strategies to address this resilience, from coastal flood protection to small business and resident preparedness programs to energy resilience to zoning. We're going to focus on just a couple of these around sea level rise right now. But again, I'm happy if you want to reach out, we can talk about any of these in particular. Next slide. So looking at that coastal flood risk, we embarked on two major pathways. On the bottom, you see a number of citywide policies that were developed over the past few years to address buildings and work and activity that is happening in that potential future floodplain, from a new wetlands protection ordinance that addresses environmental justice and coastal resilience, to design standards for projects that interact with the public right-of-way, to the new recently passed coastal flood resilient zoning overlay district and guidelines passed by the Boston Planning and Development Agency that sets real requirements and standards for construction and development in the future floodplain, asking for an elevated design flood elevation for properties, asking for elevated mechanical and critical systems, and wet and dry flood proofing. Across the top, we see another set of initiatives we've done, which is to embark on a series of detailed neighborhood by neighborhood coastal resilience plans to look in detail about where that flooding is coming, when it is coming, and identified solutions, coastal infrastructure projects that can be constructed and are in fact some of them in construction now across that 47 miles of coastline. Next slide. So here online, you can see, we'll send the link out to this coastal resilience project tracker. This last August, we completed the final neighborhood report for those 47 miles of coastline. So we have an identified timeline of where the projects need to be implemented first, how much they'll cost, and preferred designs that we've worked with the community to develop. And you can track progress on these projects there. Next slide. We, of course, have not just been doing that planning, but we have been implementing where we have opportunities already. So this is an example of the newly renovated Langone Park in downtown Boston in the North End. This park was up for renovation. So during the renovation, we built into that natural capital cycle an opportunity to improve resilience in the park itself with increased shading and stormwater retention and treatment opportunities. But also here you can see built-in increased elevation so that while this park maintains access to the coastline and open space for people to enjoy today, it is also elevated in a way that it will protect the park and the residences and businesses behind it from coastal flooding. So this is part of the strategy that we're employing across the coast. Next slide. Now, of course, when we look at this slide in here, this is the city from a slightly different angle, looking out from the harbor into the city. We're acting on the projects we can now, but much of the coastline is owned, not just by the city. In fact, relatively little is owned by the city. Much of it is owned by the state, and the majority is owned by private property owners, so residents and businesses. So in order to move from a risk scenario like this to next slide, the vision and the design we have for Boston, which is a resilient and protected, but still accessible and shoreline that people can enjoy, is going to take an unprecedented level of collaboration, as Amy said, with all of the property owners across the city to make these move from plans to real implemented projects on the timescale that we need to make sure that we're resilient to those coastal risks in the future. Next slide. So that was a little bit about the risks that we face in Boston with climate change. We can't responsibly work towards addressing those risks if we're not actually addressing the source of those risks, which is the emissions and the carbon pollution that is created. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about our strategies to reduce our emissions and achieve carbon neutrality. In Boston, as across most other cities, these can be boiled down to pretty simple strategies, and then the complexity is in the implementation. So we have to reduce our demand for energy by increasing our energy efficiency across all of our sectors. We need to convert nearly everything that runs on fossil fuels to electricity or other clean fuel sources. And then we need to buy clean, renewable electricity, clean energy. We've done some also in-depth studies about pathways to achieve carbon neutrality, a report with the Green Ribbon Commission called Carbon Free Boston. So we know that this is technically achievable. We're not waiting for new magic technologies to be created, but it is about accelerating implementation with the technology we have. Next slide. Here I'm going to highlight and focus on our building sector, because our building stock is where, as with other developed and dense cities, where our dominant source of emissions is. So in Boston, about 70% of our emissions come from the building sector. And in Boston, we have about 86,000 existing buildings that are going to need to be retrofit, upgraded, decarbonized over the next 30 years in order to achieve these goals. So if there's one takeaway, it's emissions reduction is very much about existing buildings in Boston. Next slide. So to address that, over the last few years and recently passed in October of 2021, we've developed an emissions performance standard for existing large buildings. Next slide. Commonly referred to as BERDO, the Building Emissions Reduction and Disclosure Ordinance. Many of your institutions are covered by this policy today. So this is a brief PSA. Energy reporting and data verification has started this year. So if this hasn't happened yet for your institution, please reach out. The deadline is December 15th. We'll be happy to help get you into the process as soon as possible. So while energy reporting has been happening for a number of years via an older version of this policy, this new updated version, this emissions performance standard, sets binding carbon emissions targets for existing large buildings, 20,000 square feet or larger, that decrease over time every 5 years, tightening the standard until they achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. That's consistent with all of our city's emissions reduction goals. So this is going to be a major initiative where folks will need to look at their buildings, look at how efficient they're performing, where are their opportunities to transfer their electricity use to renewable sources, and when the time is right, through upgrades of mechanical systems to switch to efficient fossil fuel-free solutions for heating and cooling. We understand that buildings can't do this alone, so we're building up a series of resources to support buildings in this transition. And again, encourage you to reach out if you have any questions about this. Next slide. While the dominant work is about our existing buildings, we also want to make sure we're not contributing more buildings, especially brand new buildings that are going to need to be retrofit briefly after they're opened. So we have 3 initiatives I'm going to touch on briefly that are moving towards helping decarbonize our new buildings so that they're constructed from the beginning efficient and fossil fuel free. One is a zero net carbon building zoning initiative through the Planning and Development Agency. This will cover existing large buildings, 20,000 square feet or larger. Next slide. Oh, there we go. And also for all buildings, Mayor Wu has recently passed, with the help of City Council, a home rule petition, a request to the state to participate in a pilot that would allow us to adopt citywide fossil fuel-free standards for new constructions and major renovations. Now, the timelines and the details of these standards are yet to be developed. That's a process that's going to be starting up shortly, so we encourage you to participate in that. And then next slide. And the state is also moving in this space. They've recently updated the building energy code that sets increasing efficiency standards for new construction and major renovations. And it also allows a new opt-in option where municipalities can opt into a stricter building efficiency code. And that's going to be available at the end of this year for adoption. Next slide. While buildings are 70% of the challenge, transportation emissions also are about 30% of our challenge. And really in the transportation space, the challenge is about commuters. About 65% of Boston's transportation emissions come from commuters to and from the Metro Boston area in single passenger vehicles. So next slide. Again, this is a lot about efficiency and mode shift. So that there's increased access to public transportation, other modes of transit across the city, more access to biking, walking, and car share, and then access to EV charging for electrification of personal vehicles. And then we're also taking on a fleet electrification. So there you can see this is not an actual school bus that we own, but we have procured 20 electric school buses that should be coming into service this school year. So we're moving to electrify our fleets that we control. Next slide. So I know that was a whirlwind tour to give you a flavor of some of the policy initiatives that are ongoing and some of the climate risks. But I'm very pleased now to turn it over to Stephen, who's going to talk about climate governance. And then I'll be happy to join you again in the Q&A session to answer any questions that may have arisen. Stephen?
Allison, thank you so much. It's great to be with all of you. My name is Stephen Rothstein. While the team is just sharing the slides and opening up the video. First, Allison, that was fantastic. If you ask I'd actually rather cancel my presentation, just ask you questions for the next 40 minutes. That was remarkable and so much great information. And this next section I'm doing with my colleague, Dan, who's going to introduce herself in just a minute. From Plan C, but we're really partnering on this together. Next slide. So I'm with Ceres. Ceres is a Boston-based nonprofit. We work with many of you and investors across the country. For over 30 years, we've worked with investors and companies. To give you a context, our investor network includes investors that have $60 trillion of assets under management, including many of the Boston firms that are large asset managers. And the state treasurer and many others to help them to move capital. Next slide, please. I also live in Somerville and spent my entire life in and around the nonprofit sector. I've run a number of nonprofit organizations. I looked at the attendance list. There are several folks here I've worked with, and I have enormous respect for all of you. And as Amy said, just thank you for, in most of your case, your voluntary leadership. You're making such an enormous difference for these important organizations that have played such a critical role in our community life. Let me turn this over to Deanne. Next slide, please.
Hi, I'm Deanne Hurd, and I'm here under the umbrella of Plan C. Plan C is an organization of individuals and I would say small companies committed to the single task of climate change. And the Plan C partners are engineers, scientists, and also community leaders and corporate CEOs. So it's a bunch of different people representing different walks of life that care about climate. Next slide. My life and my experience involves three things right now: sitting on mostly corporate boards, advising boards, which, as you'll see, I've done over 70 in boardroom presentations, many to nonprofits. And then I also do a lot of public speaking, as I'm doing now. a couple of things that I didn't put on this slide, which are noteworthy. I'm a independent trustee for Pax World Funds, which is the mutual fund complex founded in 1971, the oldest and the gold standard, investing only in companies that have shown a commitment to climate change, quite frankly, and to the environment. And Ceres and Pax World Funds work closely together on a number of initiatives. And our research analysts are terrific. Julie Gorty, especially Joe Keith on climate initiatives. I also didn't put up here that despite my business background, and I'm currently working in law and finance, in college I was a theater major and I was a music minor. So I'm very, very in love with the organizations in Boston and a patron for sure. Next slide.
So through Amy, and I just want to recognize Amy and the entire team at Green Ribbon. Just if every city had an Amy and a Boston Green Ribbon Commission, we'd be a lot further on in the planning. Among other things, and obviously organizing this and the volunteer leaders as well, they sent out a survey. So these are the responses for those of you who sent back the survey. And I'm not going to read all of these, but I want to highlight a few of them. So what are you saying? Is your organization currently implementing a plan to reduce carbon emission? 44% say yes, a number are not sure. So as a trustee, for those of you who are trustees, this is clearly an issue that needs to be on the agenda. And there are many of the things that Allison talked about that are relevant. Has your organization prepared for climate impacts? 25% say yes. So again, that is, this is for every one we work with, whether it be a nonprofit or a company or an investor, this is all a journey. No one is, quote, where we need to be, but that highlights the need. And if I skip over to the top of the next column, are you receiving questions or comments on your climate initiatives from your stakeholders? 56% of you have said yes. So that highlights, obviously it's a growing need. And then the bottom question is, has your organization made ESG, environment, social, and governance issues a priority? 2/3 are saying yes. So this is clearly a strategic issue the board needs to address. Some of you you're at different stages, and that's what we want to provide information. So I'll turn it back to Deanne for the next slide.
Thank you. You know, we've put together some terms here that are terms that, quite frankly, people sometimes get caught up on. And I also wanted to just take a moment. You know, when I go into boardrooms, whether it's nonprofits or corporate, I'll be deep into a discussion on climate, and all of a sudden somebody will raise their hand and say, you know, could you tell me what a greenhouse gas actually is? You know, what are we talking about here? So I put together a little scenario that I'd love to read as quickly as I can, which incorporates these terms and the terms on the next slide. Why don't we move to the next slide? And then hopefully this will help you. Apologies to people that know this stuff better than I. There are many of you on this call, I'm sure, but I also believe that there are trustees of these wonderful institutions in Boston that maybe don't know as much. So very simply, the Earth's atmosphere is made up of layers of gases. 99% of the gases are nitrogen and oxygen, which is great. That's what we need to live. 1%, however, is made up of the gases that control the Earth's climate. And the most important of these is CO2, comprised of carbon and oxygen. And it's the carbon component of CO2 that we worry about. Carbon dioxide is the most famous of what we call greenhouse gases. And if you think about walking into a greenhouse, it's hot, it's humid, and it's close. The reason for that is the sun comes pouring in through the glass, and then, quite frankly, the heat is trapped by the glass, and the greenhouse heats up. These CO2 emissions and the CO2 gas trap the same type of heat around the earth. That's why we call it a greenhouse gas. And it was wonderful for years and years because it kept the earth at a state of about 58 degrees. We don't want all the heat escaping at all. But in recent years, as we know, and we've seen this in Allison's slides, the earth is heating up and Boston along with it. And what does this do? Two things. First of all, the lakes and streams that are our drinking water evaporate. And as Allison pointed out, glaciers and ice packs melt and they get into the sea. And that's why we have the very serious problem in Boston of the sea level rising. Coal, oil, and gas are what we call fossil fuels. They're natural resources that come from long buried plants, ancient forms that held carbon. And when they are burned to generate transportation or whatever, they emit more of this CO2, of the carbon. Fossil fuels can be seen as creating what we call dirty energy. Clean energy is energy, any kind of energy that is not derived from coal and oil and so on and so forth. An example would be nuclear energy or hydrogen. And renewable energy is energy which comes from wind, solar, and water, natural resources which are renewed, right? So in Sudbury, renewable energy is clean energy, but all clean energy is not renewable. And net zero is the target that we have of completely negating the amount of greenhouse gases produced by human activity, to be achieved by reducing the CO2 in the world. And I'll leave it at that. I hope that was helpful for those of you that have actually said to yourself, this is terrific, but what do these terms mean? I'm happy to share that with anybody that would like it. So moving on, why, as a trustee, why should you care about climate change? You're the guardian, you're holding your organization in the palm of your hands. That's what fiduciary duty is all about. And as an overseer, why should you care about climate change? And the answer is, of course, because your stakeholders care. They care deeply. Next slide. And moving on to who the stakeholders are, we heard from legislators and regulators already on this call. They care, and they're putting into place laws and rules and regulations with which you must comply. But employees, I think, is probably one of my key stakeholders when I think about you all. We all are having trouble hiring employees these days for many, many reasons. And I would think that your organizations have exactly the same problem. Now, do employees care? Well, yeah, you bet they care. As a matter of fact, there's a fascinating article that says that 71% of millennials who are our employees care deeply and will only buy from an organization that shares its values. 64% of millennials will not take a job if their employer doesn't have a strong CSR policy, and 83% would be more loyal to a company that helps them contribute to social, environmental, and climate issues. So the younger generation cares, and what we want to do as organizations such as yours is to attract these younger people, get them aligned with our mission, because they down the road will become patrons and will become donors. So do the employees care? Yeah, you bet they do. Vendors care, your customers. Your customers, the cultural institutions of Boston, are the very people that have read about and care about climate. So I can't think of a group where stakeholders and customers as a stakeholder are more important. But, and Stephen's going to cover this, what's the most important thing? Your donors care. Your donors are high net worth individuals, they care, and the corporations in the greater Boston area. And I can give it a couple of examples after Stephen's done, but they care deeply. Stephen?
Next slide, please. So if you think about your donors, and again, this is all, we're talking about the risk, but there are enormous opportunities too. So
Right.
that the nonprofits, again, whether you're a cultural organization or you're focusing more on arts or after-school programs or history or racial justice or the range of great work that you're all doing, there are opportunities, and I'm not telling you anything new. There are many of you that have already started to do this. But these are just some examples of 5 years ago, there was not a single large investor who had said they were going to have a net zero plan. What's happened is they're individual investors, so your donors, who then say they have one of these firms manage their money. And while these firms, they aren't all based in Boston, their investors come from all over. So they collectively, over half of the institutional money in the United States has set net zero plans. They're at various stages of development, and that means the donors. And that if you think about it, so I would, if your donors represent the marketplace, over half of your donors would care about this. It doesn't mean they're going to give to you or not, but it may make them a little more interested or a little more concerned if there isn't a plan. How you get to that plan, everyone's going to get there a little differently. And as Allison said, the city of Boston does, and President Biden has a plan that we need to get to by 2030. Nationally, it's 50 to 52% reduction. We're only going to get there if all of us and the institutions that we respectively represent get there. Next slide, please. These are also large companies. Again, these are just a few logos and examples, but there are 800 companies that wrote to the G7, and we're involved with organizing a lot of these with trillions of dollars of revenue, asking for governments to do more, private sector to do more. Next week, obviously, a lot of these folks will be at COP in Egypt for the international work there. Next slide, please. But it's not just big companies. It is, click it, yeah, it is the average individual. So there was an independent survey done and said, do you think that the federal government should require disclosure? Disclosure is the first step. We can't, whether it's a city or a nonprofit or a corporation, we can only know we can only manage a problem if we have the information first. And Allison did a great job kind of explaining that for the city. So 87% of the people, including 74% of Republicans, believe the government should require disclosure. So just as, you know, over the last few decades, there was more food labeling, you're going to see a lot more climate information from companies. Right now, it's the SEC, so it only affects public companies, but it'll get into the culture, and just as a lot of things that start with public companies, then go to private companies and nonprofits. So it will not surprise me if in the next several years, particularly the larger nonprofits, are going to have to do some of this disclosure as well. And next slide, please. As I said, and I'm not going to throw a lot of details, but the investors overwhelmingly are interested, irrespective of their political party. And obviously some of the big firms, State Street, Vanguard, Green Century, Boston Walden, Fidelity, are based in Boston, so they have a disproportionate number. But even the ones that aren't here, their investors come here. So investors are working on this, and so that they're interested. And so we think that and we've seen it, and we can give examples. Again, I just from looking at the names, I know some of you are already way ahead on this, that for some of you, that if you have a plan, it will attract new donors, or it will satisfy existing ones. And for those who don't have a plan, over time, it will, for a discretionary philanthropic dollar, it will affect their decision. Next slide, and back to Dan.
Yeah, thank you. You know, we have a slide here on insurance, and you could have at the top of this slide, credit agencies, banks, anyone who is working with organizations such as yours to try to, in this case, mitigate risk. But any financial organization, such as a bank or whatever, will have the same list. I want to start here at the bottom. Insurance can mitigate risk for your, well, actually, this should be changed. Insurance is great, and it can indeed mitigate risk. But in fact, here in Boston, there are priceless collections and irreplaceable historic buildings that no amount of insurance can save. I mean, we opened up with the picture of the Gardner Museum. I looked at that and I said, yeah, what's insurance going to do for me if that organization and that building is not there? And by the same token, you know, corporations, and many of them are doing it in America, can move their headquarters. They can pick up and move. I can tell you that you can't move the Paul Revere House to Worcester. You can't move the Concord Museum to Pittsfield. Okay, so we are where we are. And once again, insurance is great, but we are dealing with irreplaceable buildings, with priceless collections. However, insurance, which does mitigate your risk, insurers are increasingly concerned about the costs involved in climate change. They are increasing their costs, and they will be passing these on to you. You know, on the topic of everybody has a boss, a couple of my clients are insurance companies, and they're the very companies that insure you all. And I've been talking about climate change to the insurance companies for a number of years. And recently I got a phone call from one of the CEOs, and he said, I'm sending a plane to Providence to pick you up. I have a board meeting tomorrow, and I want you to present on climate. The reason for this was that the insurance rating agency, and this comes down to everybody has a boss, the insurance rating agency, AM Best, you know, when you have an insurance company, it has an A+ rating or something like that, has included in their questionnaire to insurance companies 12 questions on climate. And what are the companies doing? So what goes around comes around. But the bottom line on this, and it's the same for banks or credit agencies, these costs are increasing and they're going to be passed on to you. Okay, let's look at the next slide. On the topic of insurance, let's take a look at the national United States and the $1 billion disasters that occurred in 2021. And, you know, I was interested to not see a bullet here for Massachusetts, but let's go to the next slide. Massachusetts, of course, has risks and has experienced severe weather of all different types. And I personally experienced one of them last year in October when that nor'easter, I live on Cape Cod, that nor'easter came through the lower Cape, and the people on the Cape, 490,000 businesses and homes were without power on October 27th. I was trying to get home from a board meeting, and I literally had to park my car a half mile from my house. The roads were closed because trees had fallen over. So what is happening with respect to climate is happening certainly across the United States, and Allison spent a lot of time on this, certainly, most certainly in Massachusetts. On the Cape, we worry very, very much about the sea rise, especially, and also about coastal flooding. Okay, let's go to the next slide.
So clearly, some of you, your core mission has to do with outdoors and climate, or, you know, I mean, again, from the Emerald Necklace to the Esplanade, the aquarium, the zoo, many of the Greenway after-school programs. Some of you have built it in. I mean, the Children's Museum and the new park there, and so many other things. But this is all of us. I mean, when I ran the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library, had literally hundreds of thousands of historical documents that, as Dan said, that were irreplaceable right on the water. And so it affects all of us in different ways. And again, I know that lots of you are doing things. These are the kinds of risks that each of us are facing in different ways. If you go to the next slide, I'm not going to go through these in one by one in enormous detail, but briefly, and again, you'll get these slides, but physical risks, as Allison talked about, whether it be the floods or the heat, and it's not just your building, but it's your customers. Can they get to you? Obviously, we all saw a nature-based crisis that affected all of us called the pandemic, and it changed everything we did. It may not have changed your building necessarily, but it changed everything all of us did. And climate has the same kind of ripple effect, the supply chain. And whether that supply chain is your vendors, you're trying to do in events, trying to a variety of other things, reputational risks. There are, I know of some in other cities, that nonprofits that have really not looked at this area, and they've gotten it's affected them in a variety of ways. One of the things to think about, and it'll be mentioned later, is your investment portfolio, whether it's an endowment or your savings, and what kind of investments do you have, and how do you think about climate as part of that? Again, each one of these is a whole conversation. The regulatory, obviously, Allison talked about whether it be the EVs, the buildings that are 20,000 feet and above, and many other things, depending what city you're based in. And as Dan's going to talk about in a few minutes, there's also enormous opportunities. We all know that, 2 or 3 months ago, the Congress and the president passed and signed legislation, the largest investment in climate, not just in the United States, but any place in the world. And that has enormous implications, positive. Litigation risks, transition risks as we transition to newer technologies, whether it be you're in a city that says you can't have new gas hookups, that's a transition risk. Or you want to get electric vehicles for whether you have 2 cars or a fleet, and where you're going to put a charging station. And then human capital, as Deanne already mentioned, your employees, we all want to recruit. It's an issue for all of us, and this is an area. And that if you have a plan and are working on it, I can tell you examples both in the public and the private sector where it's helped on recruitment issues. Next slide, please. So clearly, as there are thousands of details here, that's not what the board's doing. Obviously, you're at the higher level, but is setting the tone. And clearly, first is you're to be congratulated just for coming today and spending time thinking about this and looking at the long-term performance, and looking at these areas and really beginning to ask questions. A lot of, as this slide talks about, there are barriers in place, which is lack of information. And that's where, again, I appreciate what Allison talked about and Amy's leadership to try to raise some of these issues. I also want to go back to the national slide, not to go back to the slide, but to briefly mention, Dan talked about the national slide that had $145 billion of costs. Clearly, there wasn't a specific in Massachusetts, but this year we had a 20% reduction for farmers in Western Mass because of water usage. And for each of us, the supply chain of where you buy parts and materials and where some of your donors come from have enormous impact. Next slide, please.
So embracing opportunities, my favorite topic in this area. And let me start by saying you all have 2 different avenues of opportunities with respect to climate. First of all, you can put in place a plan that will reduce your carbon footprint, now that we know what that is. The other thing is that you have the opportunity to move quickly and to come up with products or offerings which address climate. And we've seen this done so well with the Museum of Science, for instance, Arctic Adventure, their Wind Technology Testing Center, and the wonderful one, which I love, on resilient Venice, which is adapting. I don't know whether you all know about this, but I'm pretty sure you do. Action Packed Boston kicked off a series of 6 public art installations for climate change awareness. One of them is an artist from Cape Cod, and he has done a stunning overlay of first the wonderful potted plover, which is an endangered species. He's done a picture of 2 of them with the skeleton and then superimposed their feathers and stuff on top. And over time, the feathers and so on and so forth will erase, and you will see this now perhaps extinct species there, on the ground. These are the types of things that are opportunities for you. I don't know whether or not you pay to see the beautiful potted plovers, but I can certainly tell you that I would pay. And so once again, I want to get back to, in addition to embracing climate change and reducing your carbon footprint, putting in place a plan and talking about it to your stakeholders from the right avenue, from the right vehicle, there are products or services which you can put in place. And in our case, there are indeed artistic and things such as I talked about for the Museum of Science. So think about that. I just mentioned something that I want to make sure I hit on probably twice, and that is, you are trustees. The bulk of you on this call are trustees of this organization, and you are monitoring and you are overseeing what your organizations do. One thing that you should look at, because you're at a high enough level to be able to look at it, is the message from your organization regarding climate, is it reaching the stakeholder audience through the correct channel? And if you think about that, there are different channels. When I go into the theater and I open up the playbill, that would be a great place for me to see something on climate. The website, obviously, employees and patrons go there. There are different opportunities and there are different delivery vehicles for your climate message, depending on the stakeholder. And that's your job as a trustee to make sure that's being done correctly. Okay. Next slide. So when I speak to those of you that are overseeing organizations, I many times get the question, how do we do this? What's the first step? And indeed, the first step is really to work with your executive team and to find out what's already being done, and then create a document that outlines that. This has many, many advantages. First of all, if you're approached by a bank or an insurance company and they say, what are you doing in this area? You have a document. It also provides a steady state, ground zero place to expand from, right? This is what we're doing today. This is what we hope to do in the future. And certainly, you have to determine where you want to go, and you have to put together a climate action plan. And then once again, this communication with stakeholders. How is it being done? Through what avenue? And number 6, consider offering one option of climate-oriented retirement fund for your employees. What a simple way to indicate to your employees that you're committed to climate, that you're committed to change the world for the better. So these are the steps that we usually take. And I think, Steve, in the next slide, you're going to talk more about the questions that the trustees should be asking management.
Exactly. So, and just on this, as an overarching to these 6 questions, knowing that some of you are large institutions, some are small, obviously you have lots of different purposes. Some, your purpose is very different, whether it be, again, educational or cultural, and so trying to balance that. The first overarching is, don't let the perfect get in the way of the good. Don't let the perfect get in the way of the good. Get started. Again, many of you already have gotten started. And these are questions, again, in terms of asking management, are strategies at risks? That strategy could be, is your building, or think about what happened with COVID. I mean, we all face things that we never thought would happen because, again, it was a nature-based crisis. I just read a report that said in my lifetime, there will be another pandemic, not whether there is or not. And we've done reports that show, just to give you an example, there is more risk on the balance sheets of banks and insurers because of climate today than there was from subprime housing. So imagine if, because of climate, it doesn't affect you directly, but your bank is affected, or your insurer is affected, or other things. So the domino here is very dramatic. We've also, there's going to be dramatic climate migration. There will be climate refugees, maybe even some in Massachusetts, who they won't be able to live or work where they live or work today, and that'll put more pressure on other places. So are your organization governance dealing with this? Do you have a committee, and we'll talk about this in just a minute, at the board who looks at this on a regular basis, just like you do a variety of other issues? Are you building in a strategic plan? Like the city is, they talked about, Allison talked about in terms of the capital planning with the Langone Park. As you're making updates, how are you building that in? Is there a process to address these risks? And have you thought about setting a net zero goal? Again, we're not suggesting that only parks and aquarium and museum of science should do this. We all need to do it in different ways. How we get there might be a little different as part of that. Next slide, please. So this is just, again, some ways to think about these questions. And just as you think about some major strategic questions, I'm sure you're all thinking about, well, if there's a recession, what are we going to do? It's going to affect everything. It's going to affect the building. It's going to affect the number of people who come to your services. It's going to affect philanthropy. Well, climate is the same kind of thing, that it could affect a variety of your elements. It's not just one area. To take a look at that. And clearly, Amy and her team have developed these templates for climate plans that are enormously helpful. Deanne, back to you.
Thank you. Before we move off this slide, back on the thought of opportunities, in the wintertime, I'm lucky enough to spend time down in Sarasota. And I was very close, as you might imagine, to Hurricane Ian, which smashed into the west coast of Florida. Sarasota took a hit, but nowhere near as bad as some of the other locations. The point, though, that I'm going to is that it was not the corporations in the greater Sarasota area that put together the relief plan. It was the cultural institutions. And not only did the leaders of these institutions come together for a relief plan, but they put together a series of concerts to raise money for the relief. So there's an opportunity that I saw firsthand of cultural institutions really leading the charge on a very important initiative. So let's take a look at this next slide, which I believe is a slide on committees. And listen, these committees are, for the most part, corporate committees, but you all have audit, finance, governance, and nominations and compensation. So what I'll say about this is that one of the first things that you need to do is to figure out how the board of trustees is going to monitor this whole area, and it's done in different ways. Some organizations form a separate committee. I'm chairing 2 ESG subcommittees on my corporate boards. But if you look at these committees, it's pretty easy to understand how to divide the risks. Risks with respect to climate probably will fall under audit. Governance, you should be asking yourself, do we need somebody? Is there anybody on our board that knows about climate change? Is there anybody on the board that is leading the charge, that wants to oversee this area? And then under compensation, many companies are tying at least their bonus plans to ESG and climate initiatives and metrics. So should you as an organization be thinking about your executive director and whether or not that person's bonus should be tied to some metrics having to do with climate? Okay, next slide. So the time is now. And if we haven't convinced you, if Allison alone did not convince you, then we have not done our job. The time is now because as trustees, you should be thinking about the risks involved with climate. You should also, however, more importantly, be thinking about the opportunities that your organization has in front of you to differentiate yourself. And, you know, I have to tell you, there are very few times in a cultural organization's history where you might have what we call a first mover advantage, or the ability to leap out in front and really put a stake in the ground. So this opportunity is in front of you. It's incredibly important to your stakeholders that you recognize this, but the opportunities for moving forward and addressing climate in a thoughtful, concise, and complete methodology are in front of you. Be the leader. Next slide. There are
As we close up, so these are some resources that there was a question about, you get the slides. Yes, these will be sent out. And when they send out, you have hyperlinks. When these are sent out, also, I'll include my email or put it in the Q&A now or something. Happy to follow up if there's more detailed conversation. So we want to get to the questions. And Amy, if you want, there's a question in the chat. I can talk about investments. I'm happy to answer, or I'll turn it back to you and do it any order you want, Amy.
Great, thank you. I think we're all going to be put together on the screen. And while that's happening, Stephen, why don't you take that question and then we'll start going through.
Sure. So again, to make sure everyone, assuming a Boston Cultural Institution embraces a plan to become carbon neutral by 2050, how does it reconcile an endowment policy that is that's not the primary objective versus maximizing returns? Would you be able to do more with the money to meet the mission? As I said earlier, there's over $60 trillion of investments that have made net zero commitments. Every one of those investments, let me say that again, every one of those investments, their goal is to maximize their return. They are not, and these are, in some cases, some of the biggest firms, again, State Street and BlackRock and Vanguard, and there are also smaller firms. And so it is not a question. In fact, if you had taken $100 10 years ago and put $50 in the S&P average fund, and taking the other $50 and put an S&P fund without oil investments, the one without oil investments, you would have made more money on. Now, in the last 6 months, it would have gone the other way. So this is not a trade-off of fiduciary responsibility. Whoever is managing your money, they probably have someone who knows this. And if not, feel free to reach out to me and I can suggest other people. I would never suggest anyone compromise your return, your fiduciary, but that's not what we're talking about here. You can set a net zero plan and get the highest return. Amy, back to you.
Great, thank you. I'm going to start with just a few of the factual questions so we can knock those out of the way and then move on to some of the more discussion type of questions. So Allison, a few of these are for you. What's the best way to keep up to date on the changing Boston and Massachusetts regulations?
It's a good question. Things are moving quickly. So I think that one answer is, and I'm sorry for it, is our website and our mailing list. And we're happy to put those in the chat, where we're keeping lists of not only our latest plans and the projections, and there's maps where you can see the risk and zoom in and look at the individual risks at your institution for heat, stormwater, sea level rise, coastal storms. But also we will be mailing out sort of regulatory notices as we begin public comment periods or public engagements for the new regulations that are being developed. You'll be able to get on that list and understand where they're coming. And then I think great resources like the Green Ribbon Commission itself are putting out help to aggregate and summarize some of these actions. I would say that things are moving quickly also at the state level. So there's a lot to follow there as well.
I think one of the challenges here, especially for institutions in this sector is, and again, especially after the pandemic, it is unlikely that you have a government relations department that is dedicated to tracking climate policy changes. And that's why we wanted to talk to the board level, because I'm not saying, you know, a person needs to be hired full-time for that role, but somebody probably needs, if you are of any size, somebody needs to be paying attention to this, and it needs to be built into their job. And that is a way of mitigating the kinds of risks that Stephen and Deanna have been talking about. And that takes resources. There was a question I'll just answer quickly about sea level rise. Sea level rise in Boston is increasing at about 0.2 inches per year in Boston Harbor. It is accelerating, and we are also accelerating at a faster pace than the global average, which has to do with a lot of melting ice and ocean dynamics that I won't go into, but this is not a question mark, it's a certainty. Question on energy for EV charging stations. No, there's no requirement for the percentage of renewable energy, if I understood that question properly, but the grid as a whole does have requirements for every year, every 2 years, reducing the percentage or increasing the percentage of renewable energy in our grid. So anytime any of us plugs in a lamp, over time, that electricity will be greener. Let's see. So let's get into some of the questions that have to do with sort of where do we start? There's a lot of ways that this question has been answered. So, okay, we're convinced. What resources do we turn to? How do we begin to get our arms around this problem? How do we shape it? I have a couple of thoughts on it, but let me hear from the other panelists first.
I'll jump in and others. So I guess first is to do an internal assessment. Where are you in the process? Do you have a senior person who's focused on this? As was said, we would recommend having a point person, like any big issue, you have to have a point person. Like if you can clone Allison, that'd be great. But if you can't, whoever the right person is, and then to have a committee, because it won't just affect one area. It'll affect your capital planning. It'll affect your events. It'll affect your recruitment, your donors, your portfolio, your HR, your pension. So have a senior committee. Talk to others on this call or through Amy. Again, I don't want to make more work for Amy, but because there's probably, there are lots of people on this call who have done lots of great work to see, depending on the size, whether you hire your consultant or 3 or 4 of you get together. And then we're happy to be a resource as well.
Yeah, and I would say, you know, my work, I'm happy to be a resource for any of you. And, you know, because I have been speaking to boards on this issue, I do know a number of organizations that are actually doing the hard, you know, boots on the ground work to try to actually come up with the carbon footprint, for instance, of an organization or something. But both Stephen and I are at your disposal. And I would actually say, as I did when I presented the slide, that, you know, taking an assessment and putting together a document is truly the first step. You also need, however, each one of you to learn about climate. You just need to figure it out. And there are any number of books around. I can recommend several that will help you do this. So become educated yourselves too. That's always a good first step. You become the advocate.
So my name keeps getting mentioned, and I want to say I am the tip of the iceberg of the Green Ribbon Commission and the broader network that we represent, as well as other resources in Boston. We are very wealthy in climate experts here in the city. So on your board, who do you have who is, affiliated with a university? Harvard, MIT, BU, they are all extremely advanced in their climate work. And they're also really generous with their time, and they are teachers by nature. So that's a very good resource. Each of our sector working groups, so the cultural group here today is just one sector that the GRC works in. We work in healthcare, commercial real estate, and higher education as well. And each of those groups has expertise within it. I would be happy to connect you. And probably you have on your boards people from those sectors who can also connect you. Each of those sectors has support organizations. I will call out just A Better City, for example, that is doing very close work with the city and the state as the buildings regulations develop. So I would hate for the GRC to be held up as the source of all expertise, but we can connect you with many, many experts. And I agree with Dion, look within also. A lot of times this is a great growth opportunity for an employee who personally knows a lot about this, may have put solar on their house or whatever it is, and is really interested in moving this forward on behalf of their organization. And then finally, we do offer, I'll say again, the Climate Action Planning course, which we put about 16 or so cultural institutions, the Museum of Science, Paul Revere, many others I could name, through this year-long process of learning how to organize yourselves, how to think about a climate action plan. And it's really based on a behavioral change model or an organizational change model. So it's not just like, let's plunge you in with all the technology, but how do we think about organizing us from top to bottom to be able to address this problem? So I think there's lots of resources, and I think start somewhere is the main thing. So let's talk a little bit about some of the specific examples of, and I'd love for people to jump in on the chat, of institutions in Boston that are making good progress. And it's not limited to the climate sector. In fact, I mean, to the cultural sector. In fact, I would say the cultural sector is probably on the lagging end, which is another reason we wanted to do this. But Allison, as you look out across the city, where do you see real pockets of, examples of movement ahead, forward leaning?
So I think, like you said, Amy, you can see them across many sectors. You have actors that are really leaning in and taking leadership across Boston. A few examples that we could elevate are, we know that, again, some of the universities have really taken major steps at looking at what do large-scale renewable electricity procurements look like for their campuses so that all of their power is sourced from renewable sources from now out into the future. Some examples there, one that comes to mind is Boston University has just made a large power purchase agreement to generate all of their electricity from renewable sources. Other institutions, I know in the cultural institutions, obviously the Museum of Science and the Zoo and Harvard Museum of Natural History and the Huntington Theater. So many of these are already, and I think also the Red Sox are already through this climate action planning process, taking those critical steps to look at their systems in their buildings, look at their cultural programming, and begin to understand how they can move forward. So I think there's great learning to be done across those. There's also examples of buildings like the Children's Museum that are taking a really deep look at their resilience. They're on the coast in the Fort Point Channel. So they've begun in-depth assessments of their flood risk and strategies to address it both in the building and how they could connect in to district coastal resilience plans. So there's examples, or Boston Medical Center has taken a lot of action on operational efficiency and emissions reduction. There's great sources to look to across the city. I do think we could be better about elevating them, raising them up, and giving folks an opportunity to connect with and learn from them.
That's very helpful. And there's so much cross board membership and cross leadership in a city of our size that you know, I again, the opportunity for learning from the network. There are also many consultants. I don't want to call out consultants on this call specifically, but who will come in and begin to measure your carbon footprint. And there's also Mass Save as a resource as well. So this sort of segues us into a question about, well, okay, what are the financial resources to help pay for all this? And again, this is not a simple answer, but there are financial resources available. And I will just, I'll let Allison answer from the city side, and then Stephen, maybe you know, you have some thoughts about bonding and borrowing. I will also mention the Mass Cultural Council, to which I'm sure you all belong, and they are also there are some funds there, I believe, but also they're offering resources about how to look at not only decarbonizing, but how to fund decarbonizing. And they have 2 webinars coming up. One is immediately following this one. So if your appetite has been truly whetted, get on the Mass Cultural Council webinar on what is it called? Cultural Facilities, Paths to Decarbonization today. And then there's another one in December that you can go look at. But so Allison, I know there are mechanisms in the city for off-book financing.
So are you talking about the TELP?
Yes.
You mean, okay, yes. So there are mechanisms within the city for some off-book financing. They are detailed, and I will send out resources about them. They're also, and I think what Amy was talking about is BIDFA, our Boston Industrial Research and Finance Authority, has some leasing. We also have some PACE opportunities for financing. We also have a new Mass Save resources that have come out. Our recent utility efficiency programs have recently released some new whole building retrofit incentives that are available to institutions. And I think most importantly, on both the resilience and on the decarbonization side, this is going to be about combining city, state, and federal resources. So when we look to the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act that I think Stephen might touch on in a minute, there's some really amazingly strong tax credits, tax incentives, and other packages that have been put together there to help buildings with access to renewable energy and decarbonization resources. And then the Biden infrastructure bill, we're looking at how to optimize on the resilience side, to partner with institutions to propose to build some of those, or all of those large coastal resilience projects. So it's really about combining all of those resources and leveraging the state and federal dollars to the maximum extent feasible. Stephen, do you want to go into more detail about the IRA?
Sure, yeah. So the Inflation Reduction Act. So again, there was $369 billion and a combination of direct grants and tax credits, because not everyone in Washington was sure if it would go through. So they're literally in the midst of the planning now. So for example, I was on a call on Monday with folks from Department of Treasury who are writing, they're issuing 6 different rules for tax rebates or other things for electric vehicle charging and other things. Now, it may not, obviously as a nonprofit, you can't take advantage, but maybe there's a sale leaseback, maybe a creative opportunity with a donor that they help buy it, a vehicle, or pay for a charging station, and they get the tax benefits. So the rules aren't all written yet. but to stay in touch or have somebody in your team look at the Department of Treasury website in the next few months, and talk to your member of Congress about what's the best way, because it's going to be mostly Department of Energy, a little bit of EPA and Treasury on that piece of it. I'm not as familiar with the state resources, but DOER clearly, and there are other resources with the climate bill that was recently passed here. But the IRA and the infrastructure bill has between those enormous resources, it doesn't mean, and again, if there's a consortium, if one of you is focusing maybe to share information with others. Amy, back to you.
I think this is the topic of our next webinar, is to explore in detail the panoply of funding opportunities, because they are many, but they are also complicated to know exactly how to access and exactly how to bundle for each institution's unique needs. Tim Ritchie from the Museum of Science says the elephant in the room is funding for infrastructure. I don't know if anyone has a comment on that other than, yes, that is true. Not easy money to raise. And Tim, I think you're suggesting maybe public-private partnerships. And I think that's something, again, we could explore in a discussion devoted to that. But yes, noted. And
let me not push back, but elaborate. Yes, it is hard to raise money for a new boiler, but if you say I want to raise money for the phase 1 of our net zero plan, you can raise money for that. Now the phase 1 might be a new boiler or a new berm or a new whatever it might be. So if it's this is a context that can help to raise money. This is obviously an enormous risk, but I also think from a donor perspective, it is an opportunity. When I was at Perkins School for the Blind, for example, we want to build a greenhouse, and we did it with geothermal. So it is our, quote, green greenhouse. It didn't use almost any fossil fuel as part of it. And that helped to sell some opportunities with donors. And there was a state grant that we got from DOER at the time.
Yeah, and that reminds me of a topic that I've heard discussed among the leadership of different cultural institutions. I think particularly this idea was, the first time I heard it was from Carol Charno of the Children's Museum, but your development staff, who are probably accustomed to going out to speak to major donors about your next exciting exhibit, it would probably be helpful to help them learn the language of climate, the language of the needs that is coming up, that is more like this infrastructure and more like the resilience needs that the institution is going to need to face. And figuring out how to put that in terms that is appealing to donors, I think is a new step. But as has been demonstrated here, that's what your donors are going to care about, or are increasingly caring about anyway. So in the last few minutes, well, actually, one more question on this, and that is, how Will is asking, how can we ensure that if we put in an expensive new system, expensive new infrastructure, that it's not going to be a stranded asset 25, 30 years from now? How do we, where's our crystal ball to know where this is all going?
None of us have a crystal ball, but I think it is clear that society is moving to decarbonize. So, is hydrogen or clean carbon capture the right area? And there's lots of it. But if you say we're moving to decarbonize, you're going to be a lot better off than if you don't. Because the flip side is deciding I'm not going to do it, then I can tell you definitively there will be stranded costs. If you decide there are too many choices, I'm just going to stay where it is and stay fossil fuel, you will have stranded costs and reputational risks in the coming years.
Excuse me, Amy, I would just weigh in on this financing question. And I'm not sure exactly how you access it, but I do know that there are any number of venture capital funds that are being formed specifically to invest in products and services that have to do with climate. So to the extent perhaps those people are patrons or donors, they could be tapped. I'm not sure you could get to the fund unless you have an innovative. I read something about the Children's Museum that struck me that could be something that could be venture funded. So you have to be very, very creative in this area, but there are other avenues, and many, many people are crossing over, as you know, from the venture world. They could be on your board, they could be, part of your donor base.
Yeah, I think declaring this to be an area of interest will open up doors to conversations of all kinds. And doing nothing will keep those doors closed. So hopefully we've been able to at least stimulate some thought and some conversations in some boardrooms around the city with this program today. In the last couple of minutes, I do want to get to a really important question. I think it's a very important question that Max Hodges from the ballet has raised, and I'll just read it because it's short. For most of our organizations, our main vector of social change is our art making. To what extent do you view the art itself as part of the solution? And I just want to say, first of all, I could not agree with that statement more strongly. And this is the unique opportunity of this sector. You're communicating with millions of people in audiences every year. And it doesn't have to be literal, like the piping plover example you gave, Gian, which was part of the Green Ribbon Commission's Action Pact, and the zoo was great for kids and for the zoo. It was very, it was a literal depiction of a disappearing, extinct, endangered or listed at least species. But anything that provokes people to think differently about change and to understand their role in society differently, because we are all collectively going through this experience, I think is an enormous contribution that this sector alone can make. So I don't know what anyone else has thought. And I have lots of examples of terrific exhibits and performances around the city, but I won't go into them all right now. Allison, did you have a...
I think that was my voice, Amy. Deanne, I couldn't agree with you more. And quite frankly, dance resonates in my mind with just a fabulous opportunity. I mean, and once again, it doesn't have to be a literal connection, but a piece of choreography that reflects the future, a piece of choreography that somehow brings this forward. Same with music, okay? Same with theater. This is the opportunity that this group has. That's the product that I was talking about, right? In addition to your plan, the product is a cultural offering, and dance is the perfect example. So I think it's a tremendous opportunity for creative genius. I really do.
And I'll just add to the chorus here. I think that so much of what we talked about today was about the risk and the need to act, and that is there and that is real. But so much of helping people absorb and participate in that change is helping them see the opportunity, sort of the vision of the city that we're trying to create, that is not just about risk mitigation, but using these opportunities to leverage to create a more, not just a protected city, but a more connected city, a thriving and resilient city that people want to be in and live in the future. And so how are we transforming our modes of transportation? How are we transforming our built environment? Helping people understand and see a clear vision of those is so critical to the success of these efforts.
I could not have said that better. I'm sure as trustees, you've all been reading the hand-wringing articles. I've seen several of them in the New York Times. Oh my gosh, post George Floyd, post pandemic, how does this sector, how do these large institutions remain relevant? And here's your opportunity, right? Yeah. Right here. Not that I think any of you is irrelevant. I don't agree with those articles, but this is a chance to incorporate some very, very current conversation in and lead the conversation, frankly, which which is always welcome. So I think I'm going to end on this note because I do want to take a second to thank you very, very much, Deanna and Stephen, Allison. So many people have stayed on here till the bitter end, and I've seen lots of thanks and complimentary comments in the chat. We will send the slides around, and we will also send people's contact information. I think everyone here is very open to the extent that other professional obligations permit to answer questions and to try to be more helpful. I want to thank again Gwil and Sharon for their leadership on this, and Azanta for behind the scenes running the show with some help from Adam and Todd here. So thank you all again. And I look forward to seeing you on our next program, which apparently is going to be about financing.
Thanks so much.
Sounds good. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.